All right, we will get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a set of conversations about the American Revolution and America's role in the world. We're just enormously grateful to the George Washington Presidential Library and Mount Vernon for hosting us in this really extraordinary setting. This gathering is part of a large and ambitious project for us at the American Enterprise Institute, and I want to say just a few words about it before we get started. 2026, as all of you know, will mark the 250th anniversary of the American founding. A lot of organizations are going to recognize that milestone in a variety of ways, but in thinking through what kind of distinct contribution we in particular might be in a position to make, we decided that we should produce a lasting intellectual product through a set of conferences that then will yield a set of books and further educational materials that explore how Americans should understand some of the key themes and questions at issue in our country's founding today. Those materials can outlast the anniversary. They can serve educators and students and citizens for many years to come. And to do that, they'll draw on scholars from a variety of fields with a diversity of viewpoints to offer Americans some wisdom about our civic and political inheritance. So over the course of more than 2 years, we're hosting 8 scholarly conferences, each of which is devoted to a particular facet of the character and legacy of the American Revolution. We've had 5 of these. The first considered democracy in the Revolution. The second looked at some of the economic facets of the American founding. The third was about religion and the American founding. The fourth was on natural rights and the common good and the Revolution. The fifth looked at slavery, equality, and the Revolution. And today's is the 6th in the series. Each of these will result in a book of essays on its theme, as well as video and audio and digital media products. The first 2 of those books from our first 2 conferences are now out. They're out there on the table, and you're welcome to them. The third, on religion and the founding, will be out very soon. And these books then will be gathered into a collection to be published in time for the July 4th, 2026 anniversary, and to be widely distributed as an educational and civic resource. We'll make them available to public libraries, to college and high school instructors, and to interested citizens beyond. They'll be online. Our goal is really to create a kind of 21st century literature on the founding and to help inform and reinforce the growing movement for civics education and civic learning in America. Movement that I'm glad to say really has been building some steam in recent years. Today's gathering is distinct in part because we're hosting it here. And as I say, we're just enormously grateful to Mount Vernon and to the George Washington Presidential Library for the hospitality and for the ideal setting for this particular set of conversations. In today's gathering, as in every one of these 8 conferences, we're taking up a subject that demands careful thought and that will benefit from the attention of scholars from different disciplines and different views. And today's subject is also, like the others, I think, exceptionally timely for us. It's not just a historical subject, but also in its own way, of course, a very contemporary subject. The international context of the American Revolution is absolutely essential to understanding it. It's front and center in the Declaration of Independence, which takes itself to be staking a claim for America's separate and equal station among the powers of the earth, and to be working to shape the opinions of mankind. It was a subject front and center on the minds of the founders and of the American people in different ways at every point in the Revolution. And of course, the character of our founding has also always remained front and center in American foreign policy and in how we've understood the place of our country and our society in the larger world. We can't really understand who we are without thinking about that set of questions. So we're going to learn about this complicated and important subject with the help of 5 great scholars this afternoon. We'll do that in 2 panels, and they'll be hosted by 2 AI scholars. The first of these will be hosted by my colleague and co-editor of this project, Adam White. Adam is the Lawrence Silberman Chair in Constitutional Governance at AEI, a great scholar of the Constitution and the law, and he'll moderate a conversation between Lindsay Shavinsky, who is our host here at the George Washington Library. Thank you, Lindsay, and your team. And Elijah Gould and William Hay. And then our second panel will be moderated by our colleague Corey Shockey. Corey is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI, has been both a distinguished scholar and a genuine practitioner of American foreign policy, and she'll moderate a conversation between Walter Russell Mead, Jeremy Rabkin, and Gary Schmidt. We're tremendously grateful to all of them for being here and to all of you for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Adam for the first panel.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yuval, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. Our first panel is titled The Opinions of Mankind, the Revolution in a Global Context. And of course, the name is drawn from the most famous lines in the Declaration of Independence, in which the founders wrote that a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that the people should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Of course, the founding generation's attention to the global audience, the world audience, did not end in July of 1776. It carried through the founding era. In a place like this, we should point out that among those who looked to the world was George Washington himself. In his first inaugural address, he emphasized that, quote, "the preeminence of a free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world." And so as with so many of the books that we're producing in this series and the conversations we're having, we're bringing these themes from the moment of the founding and the years that preceded it, all the way through to the early years of American government with an eye to our own time. And I have to say that the papers that the three authors on stage with me are producing exemplify that. I'm looking forward to their opening remarks, and I'll just introduce them very briefly. First, we'll hear from our host, Lindsay Chervinsky. She's a historian and the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library here in Mount Vernon. A scholar, previously she was a scholar at the White House Historical Association and the Library of Congress. Her books include 2020's The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, and 2024's Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Then we'll hear from William Hay. He's a professor at the Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, where he also serves as Associate Director for Public Programs. His scholarship focuses on Europe, Britain, and the Atlantic world, statesmanship, and American strategy. His most recent book is Lord Liverpool, A Political Life. And then we'll hear from Elijah Gould, a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. His work focuses on the American Revolution, with special emphasis on our nation's relationship with the rest of the Americas, with Africa, Europe, and beyond. His books include 2012's Among the Powers of the Earth, The American Revolution and the Making of a New World Empire. And his next book is a study of the Treaty of Paris. So we'll begin with Professor Chervinsky. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is a delight to host this program today. When I started this job last October, I was already thinking of ways where I could partner with other organizations whom I had so much incredible respect for, and AEI was the top of my list. And then they beat me to it and asked if we would like to do this program. And it seemed just like something dropping in my lap that I couldn't have hoped for more. And then when they were asking me to write this chapter and to think about what the American Revolution meant in the world, I spent some time thinking about if there was a specific angle I wanted to take, if there was a specific event. And as Yuval said in his opening remarks, it struck me that that question was an incredibly contemporary one. And so as I was reflecting on the revolution, I couldn't help but think that the revolution was an international event, and it was described as an international event, conceived of, articulated as, and fought as an international event from the very beginning. And that continued all the way throughout our American experience. So I just want to walk through that a little bit today in my opening remarks, and then I know we'll have the opportunity to discuss that more in our conversation. I should also say that so much of my thinking on this subject is formed by Elijah's book, Among the Powers of the Earth. So it's so fantastic to be on this panel and have this conversation with him, because everything that I think about this subject, so much of it does come from that book. So when we think of the revolution, when we think of the causes and the complaints that the colonists brought together to shape their grievances when they were discussing how to work better initially with the British Empire, and then, of course, to form a rebellion, so many of those grievances were based in an international world order. Most historians will pinpoint the start of those grievances in the 7 Years' War, when many of the colonists participated with great enthusiasm as part of the British Empire. They fought alongside their British brethren. They raised funds for this conflict. They contributed their treasure, their blood, and their soil to this fight. And they were incredibly proud of having done so. But then the repercussions after the war, both the expanded territory, the increased presence of British regulars on American soil to defend that expanded territory, and the presence of new fiscal measures to pay for those things, all bred resentment among the colonists because they felt like they had already done their part. And now they were being asked to, in addition to fighting the war, in addition to being the individuals who were in the place of threat, to have the armies in their backyards, now they were being punished for having been successful. They were being punished by having a standing army nearby when Britons in London would not tolerate a standing army in their backyard. They were being punished for having fought in this conflict. And so I have a picture here of the 7 Years' War and then an escalation when the fiscal measures were introduced. And what's so interesting about the fiscal measures that the colonists opposed, in particular the Sugar Act and the Tea Act, was that it was limiting colonists' international choices. It was limiting their ability to engage economically with other international actors. And we don't usually think of the taxes in that way. We think of it as, oh, they didn't want to pay additional taxes. But the sugar tax, for example, made it harder for smugglers to bring in sugar from French and Dutch suppliers. It was trying to force colonists to buy from the English. And the Tea Act actually lowered costs to try and get the colonists to buy from the East India Company as opposed to buying from suppliers from the Dutch or the French or other international merchants. And so colonists saw these taxes as trying to force them out of the international system. And that is important because as they started to conceive of what independence would look like, it was based on having maximum options for international participation. This is especially true of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is not a very popular thing to say as we are heading into 2026, but the Declaration of Independence was kind of an afterthought domestically in the United States. It had very little impact here in the United States because by the time it was declared, the war had been going on for almost 15 months. So the war was already happening, and instead, the Declaration was very much written with an international audience in mind, in particular for the other monarchs around the world who maybe would have been uncomfortable that the American Revolution was a revolution against monarchy in general, as opposed to just against this one particular monarch. And so the drafting of the Declaration is quite explicit because it lists the grievances, 27 complaints, against King George III of his repeated injuries and usurpations to demonstrate that they were justified in their revolution, that he was an abnormal monarch, and that the other monarchs who hadn't done these grievances were not to be revolted against. And in doing so, they were trying to establish that they were safe partners for alliances and safe partners for trade. And this was especially important as they were trying to gain the support of France and Spain in the forthcoming war with Great Britain. After they declared independence and the Continental Congress and then the Confederation Congress was in existence, some of its very first actions were conceived with their international responsibilities in mind. So one of the very first things that Congress did was to draft what was called a model treaty. And this was a model for any of the alliances and trade agreements that they would form with nations going forward. It was largely drafted by John Adams and was used as the basis for an alliance with France and the Netherlands and other nations going forward. Just a couple days later, they appointed Benjamin Franklin as the first agent on behalf of the Congress. He was sent to France. Famously, this was captured in the recent Franklin series, which I would say is not necessarily always an accurate reflection, in particular of John Adams, but that's fine. But he was sent to France to try and gain fiscal and military support for the colonies and for their effort to win independence. After the Treaty of Paris ended the war and it secured independence, many of the concerns of the Confederation Congress and the new nation were again internationally focused. The United States had an enormous debt that they owed to many different foreign nations as well as to domestic forces. And in order to engage in any form of foreign intercourse in the future, any future alliances, any form of trade arrangements, they had to pay off that debt. Additionally, if they wanted to have any defense of their borders, if they were concerned at all about protecting their citizens and their lands, they had to be very wary of the various European empires that were hovering on the sort of periphery of American borders, eager to pick off any straggling states or any parts of the nation that were maybe a little wishy-washy about their loyalism and commitment to the United States. The inability of Congress to actually do these things, to raise money to pay off its debts, to raise money to defend the borders of the nation, to participate as a sovereign nation as part of the international community, was one of the key factors that led to the Constitutional Convention. And the Constitutional Convention crafted a new nation. It created a new federal government with three key powers that were related to international engagement that had largely been missing from the Articles of Confederation. Those three powers were the power to raise money. They no longer had to ask the states for funds and hope that they would comply, but instead could actually force them to raise money. 2, the process of foreign policy was centralized in the federal government and in particular in the executive branch. No longer would you have 13 different colonies or states crafting their own international arrangements with foreign nations. And 3, the federal government claimed responsibility for trade and economic relationships with foreign nations, as well as oversight of those in between the states. Critically, most domestic powers were left to the individual states, so the concept of a federal government was very much focused on the government's responsibilities to other nations. The American Revolution, however, was not contained within North America, nor was it contained in the 18th century. The ideas of the revolution, as well as many of the fiscal pressures, led to the French Revolution, which I have pictured here. It was, of course, a much, we'll call it more chaotic affair, certainly a bloodier one in some respects, and the ideas of the French Revolution inspired, or at least partially responsible for the Haitian Revolution as well. And these revolutions came back to the United States in the form of foreign policy pressures for the new nation. The two biggest, what I perceive as the two biggest foreign policy crises in the first decade of this new federal government, were largely a product of a foreign policy. In the Washington administration, we have what's called the neutrality crisis, where France declared war on Great Britain, and that conflict quickly spiraled into an international war, and the United States had to figure out how to try and stay out of it. It had no business fighting a war. It didn't have an army or navy, so even if it wanted to fight, it had nothing with which to do so. And it was just beginning to recover from the revolution. Washington issued a proclamation, which didn't actually say the word neutrality because that implicated a lot of legal considerations, but it essentially said the United States would stay out of it, and then spent the next several months battling citizen Edmond Charles Genet, who was the new French minister to the United States. A couple years later, tensions with France continued to bubble up, and John Adams was faced with what's called the XYZ affair, where France kicked out American diplomats who were there trying to sign a new treaty, and the insult to American sovereignty was one of the escalating forces of what we call the quasi-war. It was not actually a declared war, but it came pretty close. These foreign policy pressures also had incredible implications for domestic life. They largely shaped the positions of the two first political parties. I chose this picture in particular because it captures Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who were the ideological figureheads of the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And while they disagreed on everything, including what the United States should be in the future. One of the main sources of contention was which nation the United States would be closer to in the future. The Democratic Republicans preferred their ideological sister, France, and the Federalists preferred their largest trade partner, Great Britain. However, the United States story and its foreign policy challenges did not end in 1801 when John Adams left office, and very much continued going forward. At the end of my chapter, I sort of trace how foreign policy has always been a central part of the American existence. Have things like the Monroe Doctrine, which was written by John Quincy Adams and included in one of President James Monroe's presidential addresses, which basically declared that the Western Hemisphere was closed to European involvement. Now, of course, the United States didn't really have any sticks with which to enforce this proclamation. That took a while longer, and the Theodore Roosevelt Corollary, which was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine, basically said that this will be enforced. Now, despite these rather grandiose proclamations, the United States was characterized by moments of isolationism, especially after periods of conflict. So we see this after the Civil War, after World War I, and then there is still an isolationist force after World War II. But for the most part, for the rest of the 20th century, the post-World War II global order was very much defined by American involvement around the globe. And we are starting to see a shift in that. We are starting to see a new conversation about what a new global order should be. And so my closing message for today is that the tradition and the legacy of the American Revolution is that the United States was never in a bubble. The American Revolution was always an international phenomenon. The United States always saw itself as a member of a global community. And the legacy of the revolution is that we should embrace that the world is very much one that is interconnected and our ideas are interconnected, and celebrate that legacy of the revolution. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Professor Hay.
You don't have slides, right?
Well, thank you very much for, at least we have this microphone on. Thank you very much for inviting me and putting together this fine conference. It's a very impressive set of speakers, and the volume will be quite the contribution to an important effort to present the America 250 as part of civic education. I'd like to focus today on precedents set by the American Revolution and the earlier precedents drawn upon at the time to understand it. We look at the world around, we understand in retrospect, we look back to understand, but we live life forward. So what did people, not just Americans and the founders, and the British for that matter, look back to, but what did people in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s look back on to make sense of changes around them? How did they see the American Revolution? So precedents set and precedents referred to. Edmund Burke in 1784 spoke of the appearance of a new state, of a new species in a new part of the globe, has made as great a change in all the relations and balances and gravitations of power as the appearance of a new planet would in the solar system, in the system of the solar world. So like a new planet in the solar system, the new American Republic, the United States, which when Burke made the statement in Parliament had been recognized, or rather in a letter, had been recognized as an independent country by the Treaty of Paris, ending the war for independence. The emergence of the United States as an independent state would reshape the solar system of international affairs. And that image taps a very mechanistic view of the world, a very 18th century mechanistic view of the world. And it also highlights the importance of adapting to change. Well, what did people in this era have in mind as they struggled to adapt to change? Well, the great precedent, the last time a new nation joined among the nations of the earth, was the Dutch Republic in the 16th century. The 16th century saw the revolt of the Netherlands against Philip, best known as Philip II of Spain. Spain had ruled the Habsburg Spain ruled what is today the Netherlands and Belgium. And the northern provinces of the Netherlands claimed independence. They broke away from Spanish rule and fought a long war of devolution to make that independence stick. And that provided the most obvious comparison. There are others I'll mention in a bit, but that provided the most obvious comparison for the American Revolution. British and American commentators in the 1760s, 1770s early 1770s, looked at tensions between the Spanish and the Dutch provinces as a way to understand conflicts over sovereignty within the British Atlantic world. From the Stamp Act crisis to the Townsend Duties crisis to all of the debates about tightening metropolitan authority over the American colonies and over the wider world of the British Atlantic, the Dutch resistance to Spain provided a precedent. And Dutch efforts to impose authority, or rather Spanish efforts to impose authority on the Dutch, those two provided something to talk about, a way to make sense of this conflict for America. William Henry Drayton of South Carolina, patriot in 1776, spoke of forcing George III to treat with the United States as a free and independent people, I quote, just as the Dutch had eventually compelled Philip of Spain to yield, and to yield recognition of their sovereignty. The Spanish had eventually recognized the Dutch Republic, again, a republic as a sovereign state. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin both likened the American struggle for self-government with the earlier Dutch one. But the Dutch didn't like that. The Dutch stadtholder, or chief magistrate, essentially all but a king, the Prince of Orange, and his minister, Henrik Fagel, they both thought the comparison was crazy. They thought the comparison was unreasonable. George III is no Philip II. The British are not Spanish. There's a famous painting by Bruegel of the Dutch Revolt, and it's a depiction of the massacre of the innocents from the story from the New Testament of King Herod ordering the massacre of babies when he heard news of a newborn king. King Herod, well, Bruegel's painting was set in Flanders, showing Spanish soldiers massacring Dutch children too. And this was a way of capturing that 16th century moment. So the Dutch patriots were like, this isn't like George III. This isn't like today. So you see these parallels. The Dutch Edict of Abjuration on 26 July 1581, rejecting allegiance to Philip II. It's worth looking at that document because it lays out all of the grievances and all of the reasons why King Philip had forfeited the allegiance of his Dutch subjects. That's a comparison point for the Declaration of Independence with the charges against George III. Now, it's not just an example, it's not just an historical parallel, it's not just an historical precedent. The Dutch Revolt opened some larger discussions about the right of resistance and foreign rights to intervene in what becomes a civil war. Here, let me build on Dr. Stravinsky's comments and make a quick point. We should understand the American Revolution as a drama in 3 acts. The first act is a revolt, rebellion, resistance to an innovative program of British policy that broke with precedents in governing the 13 colonies. The second act followed the first, and that after Lexington and Concord. And this month, 250 years ago, the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The second act in the drama was a civil war within the British Atlantic world, the 13 colonies and the rest of the empire fighting. And then there's a third act, and that's when, in 1778 and onwards, the Civil War becomes an international conflict, indeed a global conflict. So that's a point to keep in mind. So Civil War turns into a war for independence and a global war. But the right of resistance, the right to resist a ruler, to resist lawful authority, and foreign rights to intervene, because others, outside princes, intervened in the revolt, the Dutch Revolt, those rights became points of debate. And they shaped an emerging corpus of customary international law over the century or so or more before the American Revolution. Hugo Grotius, who's a Dutch jurist, his dates are 1583, 1645, Grotius limited resistance to rulers violating a constitution. So if a ruler breaks the law, the constitution, the fundamental law, or usurps a representative body's share of sovereignty in what would have been called a mixed regime, that's justification for war. But anything more than that, any wider right of resistance threatened anarchy. What Grotius called a mob where all are speakers and no hearers. Everybody's shouting for their own thing. That might have some precedents or some recent parallels, more recent parallels in some ways. Crowd shouting, but nobody listening. And that's what Grotius feared. And Grotius quoted Cicero, the Roman figure, the Roman Cicero, who said, any peace is preferable to civil war. A war among the citizens is the worst kind of war. So this was Grotius's contribution. Grotius was a Dutchman, who lived through the revolt of the Netherlands, winning Dutch independence. And he was an important figure in arguing a lot of legal points relating to the right of navigation, the free seas. And he was a participant as well as a scholar and as a jurist, tracing out international law. Now, much later, Aimé de Vattel, a Swiss jurist, his dates are 1714, 1767. He's the author of The Law of Nations. Vattel wrote that a tyrant, resisting a tyrant, making war on his own people, making war on the nation, that amounted to self-defense. But that self-defense had to meet a really high standard of intolerable evils and justice long denied. You couldn't just say, he's picking on me, he's a bad king. You had to justify it. It had to be intolerable and justice long denied. Vattel also distinguished rebellion from civil war, and Vattel gave foreign powers a right to intervene or mediate, impose mediation on a civil war. Vattel's writings were very important for the Continental Congress. Franklin, Adams, and others cited Vattel. Copies of Vattel's Law of Nations circulated in Philadelphia. So these are key texts. And the texts come out of long debates over international law. So again, it's not just that precedent, that immediate precedent of the Dutch Revolt and the Dutch Republic, but it's also some debates about international laws that emerged over the 17th and 18th centuries that shape how people looked at what was acceptable, what was not acceptable in the 1770s. Now, the Dutch Revolt had some other formative influences. I've talked about international law. I've talked about the parallel itself. The Dutch Revolt in the 17th century, in the 1600s, was one of the most widely discussed events. And it brought a flood of publications that shaped political thought, the development of political thought, responses to other conflicts. Conflicts from the Fronde, a rebellion in France in the 17th century, where Louis XIV actually defeated his nobles and the lawyers who ran the parliaments that registered edicts and law in France. What the English historian Hugh Trevor Roper described as the general crisis of the 17th century, where governing systems across Europe broke down when they failed to adapt under pressure. That fueled important debates about sovereignty, liberty, and political order. Debates that, again, looked back to this humanist discussion around the Dutch Revolt and of the issues around the Dutch Revolt. Relevant conflicts included, again, the British Civil Wars of the 16th century, the English Civil Wars in Scotland and Ireland, as well as in England itself. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. Portugal, an historic kingdom, had been incorporated into Spain. Portugal regained its independence. So it's not a new nation among the powers of the earth, but it regained its independence. And so that's another factor in this discussion. When did a nation have a right to regain sovereignty rather than simply to claim it? Thomas Hobbes, James Harrington, John Locke, these are all names you would recognize. And these theorists, philosophers, engaged a lot of the debates and reasoned how and why governments should govern, what are the rights of subjects, what are the rights of rulers, what limits exist. So these precedents, these debates set the stage for constitutional arguments within the British Atlantic world among Americans, among Britons in the 1760s and 1770s. They also shaped how Europeans and European-derived societies viewed the balance of power. That's another point, the idea of a balance of power as part of international as well as national order. Failure to resolve constitutional differences within the British Atlantic world between colonies and Britain, that leads to the break, that leads to the Declaration of Independence. And all these precedents shaped American arguments, and then the appeals mentioned for foreign support with the Model Treaty, the Declaration of Independence. They shaped French and Spanish moves to aid the American cause, a right of intervention, claiming a right to intervene in a civil war. And they also shaped actions by other European states to uphold neutral rights. What right does a state that is not party to a conflict, what right do those states have to protect their interests from belligerents in either side of a conflict? So implicit recognition over the course of the Revolutionary War brought the United States within the European system, even before Britain formally conceded independence in the Treaty of Paris. By then, by 1783-84, the conflict had already turned, as an Englishman said, by degrees from a question of right and wrong between subjects to a war between us and a foreign nation. The United States was that foreign nation. And this gets us back to Edmund Burke's point about how the United States, as an independent, recognized sovereign nation, that was a new event in the world order. That was a new event in the political solar system, not just of Europe, but of a wider sphere of Europe abroad. Secretary of State Edmund Randolph said in 1794 that despite standing without or outside the European circle, the United States is not in Europe physically, but the country still had the same rights and privileges as other states within that European sphere did. Even though American sovereignty was recent, it still had sovereign rights. The United States still had sovereign rights. So what precedents then did the American Revolution create? Very quickly, first new independent state to be recognized since the Dutch Republic. The Declaration of Independence accepted and published as part of a positive law of nations among other treaties and documents. Recognizing American independence meant that the Declaration was a text of American independence and could be cited and used alongside other such texts and documents as precedent. American independence showed when, why, and how the sovereignty that natural law provided could be acquired in fact and in use. Now, the United States, even while trying to navigate and stand apart from the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, even during that period, the United States had a place in the balance of power, had claimed its space among the nations of the earth. But navigating that role would set a whole series of new precedents. And those new precedents would be very formative, not only for American foreign policy, but that would also have lasting influence beyond that. And we can discuss more of those in questions. Thank you.
Right. Professor Gould.
So we're being mic'd. Okay, yeah, off of this, not off of this. So, well, let me just say thank you. Repeat. Hang on. Let me open up my. Just repeat the thanks that everyone else has said. It's wonderful to be back at Mount Vernon. Always a pleasure to be here, and a real honor to be included in this event and among such distinguished company. One of the advantages of getting to go third is the audience has now been educated about things that I wondered, how much information do I need to give here? So what I'm going to try not to do is re-give information that you've already heard. Let me start, actually, I'm going to put on my teacher's hat. And a lot of what I'm going to say and a lot of what I'm working on in the book that I'm finishing now actually grows out of teaching. And when I teach the Declaration of Independence at the University of New Hampshire, where the weather isn't nearly as nice as it is here, the first thing I do is to have students read the Declaration, always a good idea. Next, I ask them a question. Who decides who gets to be an independent nation? Is it something any group can do? Is it something that we could do right now? Become History 605 nation, think Red Sox nation. I'm actually an Orioles fan, but I don't tell them that. What would happen if we did? Would anyone believe us? The point, of course, is that nations, especially post-colonial nations, such as the United States aspired to become in 1776, are self-made polities. But they need to be accepted by other nations in order to succeed. Among other things, this is a way of highlighting the fact that the Declaration's self-evident truths about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness appear in the document's second paragraph. To grasp what Americans cared most about in 1776, we need to read the first paragraph where Congress declared to the world that the 13 colonies were free and independent states and that these new states expected to be recognized as such. We also need to read the couplet at the end of the next to last paragraph that pledges to treat Americans British brethren as they did the rest of the world, that is, enemies in war, in peace friends, and the brief summary in the Declaration's final concluding paragraph of the powers that Congress intended to exercise on behalf of the new Union of States once independence had been achieved. And those four most important powers are the power to declare war, to make peace, to form alliances, and to establish commerce. Now, Congress was speaking unilaterally in the Declaration, but what Americans wanted was for the new United States to be recognized by the powers of the earth, which meant in practice being accepted as a treaty-worthy nation, I've used in my own work, by the leading powers of Europe. And I think it's worth noting here that there were not two founding documents, but three. And that the Treaty of Paris, which Will and Lindsay have both mentioned, demands equal attention alongside the Declaration and the Constitution. It was in the Treaty of Peace and Independence where Britain, the most important power whose recognition Congress needed, weighed in on what sort of republic it was willing to accept. And the Constitution, of course, was where Americans accepted the compromises, a very important point that Yuval Levin has made in his work, necessary to meet those British expectations. Okay, well, with those just sort of brief introductory remarks, I want to talk briefly about 3 points, all developed in greater detail in the written paper. The first is that peace is a term with more than one meaning. It's a complicated term. So when Congress talks in this, at the end of the penultimate paragraph, enemies in war and peace friends, what exactly do they mean by peace? First, so I want to suggest that despite the promise to treat the British as enemies in war and friends in peace, the peace that Congress imagined in 1776 was an unconditional peace, one based on terms that neither George III nor his subjects were likely to accept. And that peace has 3 parts, and I think this is important. They mean it when they want peace, but what peace means is going to have to be negotiated. Congress's 3 most important demands in 1776, first, were for all of Britain's North American colonies to join the Union, including Bermuda, the Bahamas, both Floridas, east as well as west, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and, of course, Canada, Quebec. The second demand was for Britain's Native American allies, starting with the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the most important indigenous power in North America historically, certainly, to transfer their alliance from George III to the United States. And thirdly, for all of George III's subjects in the 13 former colonies to recognize and swear oaths of allegiance to Congress and the new state governments. This, of course, is the largest group who refuses to do that. Perhaps 500,000 British Americans, about 20% of the United States pre-war population, along with most Canadians and Native Americans, refuse to do any such thing. So there's a real conflict. Peace is in the eyes. Each person, each group has their own idea of what peace means. Well, the result is that the War of American Independence, the War of Independence, was not one war, but 2. On one hand, it was a regular war between Washington's Continental Army, and this is the war that Washington really cares about, and British and Irish and German soldiers fighting for George III. Britain enjoyed substantial advantages in this war, especially before the entrance of France in 1778 that Will mentioned, and Spain the year following. Not as a formal ally, but Spain's a hugely important player in American independence. So there's the regular war. But the war was also a partisan war that patriot and loyalist militias and paramilitary units waged for the, quote, hearts and minds of American civilians. And that reference to the Vietnam War comes from the great military historian John Shai. Shai wrote some of his early work on that part of the military history under commission from the Department of Defense, thinking about how one handles insurgencies during the Vietnam conflict. So there's a real connection here between this part of the military history of the Revolution and the Vietnam War. The advantage in that war lay almost entirely with Congress and the Patriots. Britain increasingly gets involved in that, particularly in the Carolina backcountry. Some of the most savage fighting we've ever seen on American soil is waged by Patriot and Tory militias. But it's a war where Congress has substantial advantages. And that success contributes to Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, not too far from here in October of 1781, followed in the next spring, by the resignation of Lord North and by the British decision several months later to open peace talks in Paris. That struggle for the Americans' hearts and minds, one that patriots saw quite correctly, I want to emphasize, as a war for just and righteous causes. This is a just war. It's seen as such, and I don't think there's any reason to challenge that, left a deep impression. It's a just war, but the methods could be quite savage. Here in Virginia, a man named Colonel Charles Lynch's flogging of suspected Tories is oftentimes credited as the origins of lynching and lynch law. Lynching has roots in this part of the war. The last president to serve in the Revolutionary War was Andrew Jackson, who saw action in a unit of South Carolina partisans in that savage war in the Carolina backcountry. Jackson would make the tactics first learned in that war the basis for what Walter Russell Mead, who will be speaking in the next panel, has called the Jacksonian tradition in American foreign policy. So this war for peace, a total unconditional war for peace, leaves a very deep impression in American politics. Americans could only go so far, however, in forcing George III and the British to make peace on their terms. So George III is forced to recognize American independence as Congress had defined it, and the king would have liked to recognize the independence of Congress, but keeping Americans under the dominion of the crown. Ireland, in fact, had just agreed to that kind of independence. Adams, Franklin, John Jay, the American Peace Commissioners refuse, and the king is eventually forced to recognize that kind of independence. However, Britain is able to impose other conditions on the United States, and so independence ends up being an interdependent condition. For that reason, the founding is a very fragile moment, one that forces Americans to think hard about what conditions they will and will not accept. And of course, this is played out in dialogue with the powers of Europe. France has its own conditions. One of France's conditions is to pull back on Congress's continental demands. France would have actually liked to keep the American western border at the Appalachian Mountains. The two Floridas, Spain wants those. Those are off the table. Canada, So already this is happening. Britain, of course, is able to keep Canada within the British Empire. Britain's terms are, according to the Peace Treaty of Paris, Britain does recognize Congress's Western claims as far as the Mississippi. The French can't believe it. And agrees to allow Congress to earnestly recommend that the states compensate the loyalists, which basically is acknowledging that no compensation will be forthcoming. But Britain does insist that Americans repay some £5 million in pre-war debts to British creditors, many of whom were also loyalists, and about half that sum is owed here in Virginia. Virginia hates this part of the treaty. It's regarded as huge betrayal. Well, one consequence of those words, earnestly recommend, is that some 60,000 British Americans leave the United States in 1783, most for Canada, the Bahamas, and above all, Nova Scotia. Not until the 20th century partitions of Ireland, India, and Israel-Palestine would the British Empire see a comparable outmigration. This is the first of the great imperial partitions of the British Empire. The irony is that outmigration, a lot of it fleeing the partisan war that I've already talked about, makes it much less likely that Canada or any of Britain's other remaining North American colonies would ever join the Union. So that this hard partition actually ends up turning borders that had still looked pretty shaky for most of the war into hardened borders that aren't going to change. The betrayal of the Loyalists also has a series of other effects. It encourages Britain to renege on three crucial promises in the treaty. First, British officers in New York allow thousands of black loyalists, most former slaves of patriots who gained their freedom by fighting for the British Army, to leave in 1783. One, a man named Harry Washington, had been a hostler right here at Mount Vernon. George Washington is not happy about this at all. The second, pulling back, British officials in Canada refused to evacuate Detroit and 6 other posts in what, according to the treaty, is now the territory of the United States. And those posts will become very important supply points for Native Americans who resist the western borders in the Treaty of Paris. And finally, George III's ministers in London during the summer of 1783 closed the British West Indies to American ships and goods, cutting off American merchants and farmers and consumers from what before the war had been their most important source of hard currency. And historians estimate that the economic contraction that this places on the United States is comparable to the downturn of the Great Depression in the 1930s. So Britain is in a position to exact real pain. Okay, well, I go on. I talk a lot about this in my paper, which I won't talk about here. Happy to discuss it in the Q&A if people want to. That standoff with Britain becomes one of the chief reasons for revising, or as eventually happened, replacing the Articles of Confederation, the Union's first federal charter, with the Constitution that the Federal Convention adopted in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. In the 11 years that separated the Declaration and the Constitution, one of the central questions for all Americans was how to balance the Declaration's first and second paragraphs, if you will. That is, the citizens' right of self-government against the need for a government or union of governments that the powers of the earth, meaning Europe, would respect and accept. In the Constitution, the framers ultimately decided that they were willing to limit the rights of the people in a number of key areas, especially by checking the power of the states and granting the federal government new fiscal and judicial powers. But they accepted those checks in the belief that they were acting to place the right of self-government on a more secure and enduring footing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all three of you. I've got a few questions to ask, and we'll have time for questions from you too. But before I jump in, has anything been said so far that any of you would like to react to or add upon? Anything further from our initial speakers, Will or Lindsay? Well, then I'll jump in. So, because as was noted, this is the 250th anniversary, I think, this week of the shot fired around the world Maybe we'll start our conversation a little bit before 1776. I'm curious, in thinking through how the United States viewed and approached the rest of the world as it approached independence, how should we think about the Americans' changing appreciation of that need to speak out to the world? Is it something that was there from the very beginning in 1775 and earlier? Is this something that emerged over time ahead of 1776? How should we think of that in the build-up to 1776 and then in the years that followed as we fought the war?
I'll start by jumping in.
Please.
What I always think is so interesting about the revolutionary period is a changing in identity, and often the same people who had considered themselves to be the most loyal British subjects within a couple of years are starting. Sorry, that is terrible. Are starting to having to think of what is a new identity. And how do you craft an American identity that is not just not British, but is something else? And so much of that is an identity that is based on this international participation. And that was largely because most of the people we're talking about, George Washington included, grew up under the umbrella and the protection of a British system that was the most powerful navy in the world. And that brought with you a great number of hugely important economic advantages and connections and relationships. And so without that, you have to all of a sudden form your own and justify the existence of your own. And so I think of the creation of an independence as also the starting process of what it means to create an identity from scratch that is not just vis-a-vis something else.
Well, I think that's a very good point. There's a loss of a British identity. You can quote Jonathan Mayhew, the Massachusetts minister and Puritan divine, and John Adams and others speaking of themselves as British patriots and loyal to George III. Well, first Britain, and then first Britain in implementing and imposing taxes and reforms and changes in governance, and then the king in not breaking with Parliament and protecting the colonies. They were seen by Americans as betraying America. So loyalty shifts from king to Congress, and that's an important moment along the way. One of the things in the 1760s, and even before then, but in the 60s and 70s, Americans were very aware of the wider world, European events, European diplomacy. Each of the American colonies, particularly cities like Charleston, a major commercial city that reached deep into the Carolinas and even further north, Philadelphia, the Chesapeake and Virginia, of course Boston and New York, all these were very tied into global trade networks. And I mean, you think of the tea tax. Well, the fact that the East India Company was stuck running a deficit and the effort to bail out the East India Company was part of the Boston Tea Party. And so a lot of these pieces have ties and connections. And the challenge, as Professor Stravinsky points out, is creating a new identity in this global context.
Lige?
Yeah, well, I would echo what Will just said. This struggle had been playing out on a very self-consciously global scale since the 1760s. And American patriots are well aware that there are other radicals who also call themselves patriots around the world. They follow the Corsican Revolution of the late 1760s very closely. One of my favorite examples of this is the leader of the Boston mob, Ebenezer McIntosh, who names one of his children Pasquale Paoli McIntosh. And of course, the Paolis in Corsica, part of their political grouping are the Bonapartes. Napoleon Bonaparte will grow out of this. So this is an international network. The interesting thing, though, about how they position themselves, and I've been very involved in the 250th in Concord in the last few months. And it's interesting that in its first justification to take up arms in July of 1775, Congress focuses on the conflict on Lexington Common, where the British fire on the Minutemen as they're retreating. This is an act of aggression on the part of the British government, of the King's soldiers, the Ministerial Army, as they called them. To underscore the peaceful nature and nonviolent nature. We didn't take up arms until we were forced to. Only later will Americans take pride in the shot heard round the world at the North Bridge in Concord, which is where the Minutemen first commit offensive operations against the British and push them back. And there's actually, anyone from the area knows that Lexington and Concord get into all sorts of squabbles about who gets credit. But in 1775, Lexington is what Congress wants to focus on. And again, a lot of it has to do with this complexity of peace, who's peaceful, who's not. It's a difficult question.
Well, David Ramsey, who along with Mercy Otis Warren, the two of the American historians of the American Revolution, Ramsey writes that, I paraphrase heavily, but Ramsey writes that whoever's the first will claim the blame for starting a conflict. And so there's a lot of maneuvering. And Elijah's point really puts that point out there, that who fires first and who is the aggressor. And Gage was really trying to avoid being the first mover, and yet he's blamed. And this gets to the question of tyranny and the king being framed as a tyrant. There's an interesting wider point, an international point about British tyranny, and that is the tyranny of the seas. And this gets to the question of neutral rights. That the British had claimed a right to impose strict blockade, a right to stop and search, and to impose blockades at sea, including blockades on neutral states. And it's Joseph II, the Habsburg Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, and a son of Maria Theresa, called the British tyrants, British tyranny in restricting commerce at sea. Yeah. And many European powers and many others, Americans will later accept this, except during the Civil War, the idea of the free seas, that free ships or neutral ships meant neutral goods. The British said no, because British sea power wouldn't be useful then. But that, which seems like a technical detail, and it gets into a lot of legal arguments, that was very important because it became a kind of British tyranny over everyone. And this became an American grievance that European kings and princes shared.
Well, one of the clearest illustrations of what Will has just said is to look at the official British response to the Declaration written by a young English lawyer named John Lind and his friend Jeremy Bentham. And Lind and Bentham insist that all the acts of aggression are committed by the Americans. There's nothing new or unprecedented about what Parliament had done. They respond line by line to the grievances in the Declaration. They say if anyone is waging unjust war, it's the Americans, and they're waging war against all government.
Even the spread of the Declaration is such an interesting way to understand this. There's a book that's coming out next year on the Declaration by a historian named Emily Sneff, and she traces all of the copies and where they go. And there's a rush to try and get them to European capitals before they get to London. And the goal is to try and spread the word through the American lens before the British have a chance to respond. And so actually the first copy, if I'm remembering correctly, the first copy arrives in Lisbon. It's the first port where the Declaration lands in Europe. And so that in and of itself, I think, is a hopeful illustration of what the point of this document was and what they were actually fighting over.
I mean, shaping the information landscape, as we would say today, was a pivotal aim for both sides. And sending out the Declaration of Independence, the first news of Lexington and Concord came from the Congress and from the Americans, and they got their side out first. And that was very, very important. It's interesting about the Declaration that it was not the model for the French, that the Haitian revolutionaries issued a declaration to their own people, and I think it was 1800 or 1804. A group in Brabant, in what is today Belgium, the Flemish and Brabanters, who were rebelling against Joseph II's reform program, because then Belgium was ruled by Austria. they adopted a version of the Declaration, a list of grievances, and they were consciously following along that. Later in Latin America, and the Spanish were very fearful that their own colonies would follow the path that the United States had trod. But the French did not do that, and the French looked to themselves and looked to more abstract ideas. John Quincy Adams later translated a document by Friedrich von Gentz, a German writer who became Metternich's private secretary. Gentz argued that the French Revolution is not like the American Revolution. The French Revolution was was resistance to innovation and change. It was a revolution to uphold lawful order. The French Revolution was an attack on lawful order and on all morality. And it's interesting that John Quincy Adams would translate it from the German and publish it in the United States.
Lige, one last one on this?
Yeah, so I mean, that's very interesting, this comparison between the French and American revolutions. I guess one thing I'd say, we'll give a shout out to George Washington. Washington is very conscious of how the war is being waged and how this plays in Europe. So the two wars that I mentioned in my talk, the regular war, Washington is very careful to observe the rules of war. It's described by people like Vattel. He doesn't much like militias, and one of the reasons he doesn't is because militias don't care about that kind of thing. So this partisan war, it's almost as though there are times when Americans themselves are speaking with two voices, and there's quite a tension in there. And you can see that running up into the Constitution. A lot of the Constitution supporters come out of the Continental Army Officer Corps, and part of it is pushing back against that militia tradition, and that's very deeply rooted.
Well, when you were talking about the war for the hearts and minds, that was something he was also incredibly conscious of. It wasn't just sort of the order, but it was, you cannot upset the citizens you are trying to have be your fellow citizens. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And so he, even when Congress granted him enormous power to seize food, to seize materials, and to sort of give IOUs to citizens, he really, really tried not to, because he knew that it was going to make farmers really mad, because they were going to be paying for those goods in continental dollars, which sometimes were useful as firewood, and that's about it. And so he was so reluctant to do so and tried so hard to pay them back in real currency whenever he could. And just building off of your point, not only were many of the people at the Constitutional Convention officers, but a shocking number of office holders in the first federal government, in both Congress, the executive branch, and the state governments, had been in the Continental Army. And so the overlap between the Federalist Party and the Continental Officer Corps and the office holders is shocking.
Not worth a continental was the phrase. That there was a wave of inflation during the Revolutionary War, and this gets neglected, which really hurt the civilian economy. And many officers had to resign their commissions or go home to take care of their families, because families were left destitute as the medium of exchange lost its value. That Washington was engaged in a project of state formation with the Continental Army. Mm-hmm. It was not simply a tool to beat the British and to win the war. So that's simply a military tool, but it was building an institution. And Washington was very careful with precedents and with law as to create this as a system that was a regular, under rules system. And one precedent, by the way, that was very readily at hand for the British, but interestingly, the British did not follow it entirely, or didn't take it very far, and that's the Jacobite Rising in 1745, where the British harried the Scottish Highlands with fire and sword and completely reconstructed them and just behaved in a very harsh way. But that wasn't done in America, so there was a restraint. But the institutionalization, that was a concern that Washington and others had.
I see Lige wants to jump in, but let me offer maybe a skeptical question. And hearkening back to the title of the panel again, the line from the Declaration, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. Surely a decent respect has its limits. And I think this entire conversation, we focused on the ways in which the United States reached out to the world, won over world opinion in many ways, but to what extent were there limits to that? Moments in which the founders, the Americans, had to say, no, actually, we're going to have to do this thing regardless of what the world opinion is or so on. What are the limits to the founders' approach to the rest of the world?
So the clearest limit is I'm writing a book, I should know, is at Article 5 in the Treaty of Paris, where Congress agrees to earnestly recommend to the states that they compensate and restore the property seized from loyalists. And this is, I mean, the loyalists are bad. They use the Vietnam War analogy. They're the MIAs of the American Revolution. Constant sparring over this. It spent weeks on it in Paris. And Franklin and Adams and Jay just say, we simply cannot force the states to do more than that. And so that's right up against that. And this, of course, becomes, I mean, it's one of the reasons why the British step back on their own obligations. But it's written into the text. It's an acknowledgement that Congress can only go so far in paying reparations for the second partisan war.
But the British weren't, in terms of foreign rulers, princes and their ministers, or the public sphere of European debate, that the loyalists weren't, that wouldn't have been much of a concern. And one of the interesting things that strikes me is how Britain ends up so often being the villain. I think the American Revolution did not try to overthrow an established moral, legal, in terms of general law, legal system or understandings of property. And the American Revolution did not sort of try to revolutionize the world in the way that the French revolutionaries did. And that did become controversial. So the Americans were not rocking the boat in the same way, except for as a precedent for Spain and revolt there. But so it isn't a change that's going to break its boundaries the way revolution in France did. I think the challenge, and this gets into precedents the United States would later set in subsequent struggles, the challenge was for the United States to find its way through a period of protracted war in the 1790s and early 19th century as a neutral state and not get caught up on either side. And figuring that dilemma out. This gets you to the quasi-war with France and some of the issues with Britain, the War of 1812 eventually, which is a kind of second revolution. This time we really mean it. But that became the challenge and setting precedents to not become drawn into foreign wars and not.
Yeah, I would also add just there is a certain element, I think, of Congress and leaders who recognize that it was only going to go so far, and it was actually quite, I mean, one of the big debates in the historiography for a while was this a radical revolution or a conservative revolution? And one of the points in favor of it being a conservative revolution is for all the loyalists that did leave, an awful lot stay. And there is some property seizure, but on the whole, not actually a whole lot. And a lot of loyalists are able to regain what they had, and they're able to regain their stature. And within 10 years or so, it's kind of swept under the rug, and no one's really talking about it. And I think there's a consensus or an understanding that in order to move forward, you can't keep litigating these battles that have come before. And so I see that as an area of we're not going to continue to fight over the justness of this revolution. We are just going to move forward and welcome those that were perhaps of the more loyalist bent back into the fold, as long as they're willing to participate in this society as an average citizen.
So, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I guess the only thing I would say is that welcoming the loyalists back in didn't just happen. It's not that, I mean, there obviously some of this just is the passage of time, and I wouldn't deny that, but it's also the result of very hard-fought legal battles.
True.
But
there wasn't like a what we would think of as like a great reconciliation project, or
well, it happens. So it happens on a state-by-state basis. But the crucial moment, and Alexander Hamilton is involved in this, in 1784, is a law case in New York City where a brewery owned by a widow, Elizabeth Rutgers, had burned while being operated by the British Army. And Rutgers and her heirs sue the two merchants operating. Hamilton defends the merchants. It's very unpopular. This is not a small matter, huge attention, and Hamilton wins. And it's a series of hard-fought battles like that. And the federal judiciary in the early 1790s, we're still writing the history of this, but particularly here in Virginia, allowing loyalists to collect debts. And that £2.5 million sterling is a huge sum. And there is a lot of opposition, so much so that there are cases that still are hanging fire during the Jay Treaty. It's one of the reasons why the Jay Treaty is such a hard-fought thing. So, I mean, these are you're absolutely right. But that's a kind of a readmission that is the result of concerted action on the part of people like Hamilton and Washington and the Federalists. It doesn't just happen.
Well, we have microphones for your questions, and so if you'd like to raise a question, raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and the microphone will find you. You first. Not everybody at once, please. First question will be right over here.
I'd like to hear more about the process of Britain in America as an equal, because that's the treaty of Paris is why do Britain too generous? The government falls immediately after, and I'm kind of curious, like how do we get from there?
Could everybody hear the question?
Apologize for the technological difficulties. The question was, how does, if I heard it correctly and was not too distracted by the screeching, was how does Britain go about accepting the United States eventually as an equal? And I think we all sort of touched on this in various ways, but that process took a very long time. There's a reason the War of 1812 is called the Second War of Independence, and it's because from 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, to the Treaty of Ghent, they didn't treat the United States as equals. And there was a lot of resentment over that. And frankly, because at least economically and militarily and navally, we weren't equals. And so there was no reason to take the United States seriously. And so when the US demanded something, like in the case of the Jay Treaty, John Jay had absolutely no leverage with which to negotiate. And the fact that he got any concessions was largely due to, I argue, his own diplomatic skill, the relationships he had built with his British counterparts, and a general sense among the British that they didn't really want to go to war at that point with the United States, just because it was inconvenient to them, not because they feared American power. But I would be curious to see if you all agree with this. It's my sense that actually a real sense of equality does not embed diplomatic relations actually until after the Civil War.
The rapprochement between the United States and Britain, that really doesn't come until the late 19th century. That's a much later phenomenon. And we are very lucky to have Corey Shockey here, who's written on that, this shift in the late 19th and early 20th century. But Britain and the United States would, quote unquote, use each other at different times to protect interests, but that didn't mean liking each other. I mentioned Friedrich von Gentz, and Gentz also wrote in 1800 that the principle of all the European powers and European opinion is hatred of Britain. Because in the French Revolutionary Wars, and the American Republicans are nodding along to this, that the British had fought this war to the last European. They captured all the French colonies and Dutch colonies and all this other stuff. And yet they had scooped up all of the trade. So many countries, including the United States, saw Britain as the bully at sea. So you have a country that is a limited and constitutional government, a limited monarchy, a parliamentary monarchy that acts like a despot abroad, as others see it. And American merchants, American traders saw themselves as the victims and suffered all of that. I mean, one of the themes and principles in American foreign policy after the revolution was a very prickly insistence on recognition and also reciprocity. I borrowed this from Walter McDougall, that we will treat you and you will treat us. We will respect your rights and you must respect us. And to be neglected was an affront. Well, the British didn't care about that particularly. So that became an ongoing thing. One point I would make, in the 1820s, the Earl of Liverpool, the Prime Minister, said that the danger we face is that the United States and France will join again as naval powers against us, just like in the War of Independence from 1778. So that was a concern for British strategy and naval strategy right through the post-Civil War era.
So, I mean, I would agree completely with what Will and Lindsay have just said in terms of state-to-state relations. One of the bones I have to pick with diplomatic historians is thinking that there's a difference between entangling permanent alliances and purely commercial relationships. And where I think you see a very quick deepening is in economic and informal trading relationships. And in a lot of the developments that they're actually already taking shape under the Confederation, the creation of corporations, American credit systems that will be regarded as creditworthy in Europe, particularly in Britain. You get a very, very intimate and close relationship taking place, and those just strengthen across the 19th century. You also see very close relations in religious connections, so that they're all sorts of informal connections that are actually very strong. And in that regard, I think it's actually striking just how well these two systems work together. And it's a theme in legal history, the way in which, like, American negligence law around industrialization and development and improvements in the 19th century is taking cues from British law, English law. And in that regard, they're working very closely together. And so I think that's a part of the story that we don't always talk about, and that produces a very deep and intimate sense of entanglements that will be there to be mobilized during at the end of the 19th century.
John Wilson Croker, the British official and writer, said that described New York as a suburb of Liverpool.
Yeah, exactly.
In the 19th century. And this, in terms of similarity, certainly law is important, because the common law, as opposed to the civil law system or Napoleonic law system in continental Europe, similarities in law made it easy for Americans to borrow and to cite English British precedents, and a lot of commonalities in culture. I mean, Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay's History of England was widely read in the United States. There was a great craze for Walter Scott. Dickens was widely pirated in the United States during the 19th century. So the common culture and common systems and similarities, that's a very important tie. But there are other differences. And one thing I would add, a key moment is the Battle of Lake Erie. And when Perry won the Battle of Lake Erie, that cost the British control over the Great Lakes, Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes. And that meant the British couldn't support Indians on the frontier.
Which we should say is in the War of 1812.
War of 1812, yes. And so this is a later conflict, but that pulled the British back. And eventually it was a position where, interestingly enough, in the post-1815 period, as within parts of continental Europe, well, we don't have leverage there, so we can't do much there. So we will concede points where we cannot uphold any position. So the lakes in the Midwest were kind of like the Polish question, and elsewhere in Europe, where the British said, we can't do anything about this, so we will yield our precedence. But elsewhere, where we do have leverage, we will exercise that leverage.
While we're on this point, though, and while we're here at this place, I mean, I have to ask, what can we take from the nation's decision to put the capital at Washington, D.C., based on President Washington's appreciation of this point, this place that isn't just a compromise between Hamilton and Jefferson in the North and the South, but in making that compromise, putting it at a place, a major waterway that connects us both out to the Atlantic, but then ideally, maybe optimistically, back into the West, this real position of commerce from abroad and commerce into the interior. What does the selection of this place as the nation's capital add to this conversation?
Well, I guess I love rather idealistic view of the selection. I tend to see it in more realistic or pragmatic terms. I mean, I do think it was a compromise of trying to find something sort of strategically halfway between the North and the South. Certainly, there were complaints about how far away people would have to travel. So you were trying to find a middle point between the, where, so that no one would have to go too far. And then there were conversations about how far you would go east or west, and ultimately they couldn't come up with an agreement. And so they did select the Potomac River. This was part of the compromise that was made between various different factions. The federal government would assume the state's debts from the Revolution. In return, the capital would go farther south, not all the way south, but farther south, and they would lead the ultimate selection up to Washington. And I think his decision was based on three things. One, a deep belief in the Potomac as the right waterway to get to the West. He was proven incorrect in that. There's some really unfortunate rapids that are really hard to get around. But it was a belief that this river was really important. The second piece, he understood that if you're going to form a new city, it's helpful to have an existing port. So Georgetown, but especially Alexandria, was a major metropolis in Virginia and a port of trade for things coming in and out, and a nation that was so fundamentally built on international exchange. Having that port was essential for building and for getting things and people here. And lastly, I do think there was an element that it was close to home and that was convenient.
Lindsay, I really tried to tee you up for that question.
Thank you.
We only have one moment left. And there's one last question I want to get in. I'm sorry, I'm terrified of the microphone right now, but
So, rightly so.
so much has changed in the last 50 years in Americans' appreciation of history. All the books that have been written and Broadway musicals that have been staged in the last 50 years about the founding. How has our understanding of the things we've just discussed now, how has it changed, evolved since the bicentennial? What have we learned about this since 1976?
It's a great question. The thing that immediately comes to mind is if we think of the international context of 1976, and this calls up my last slide, we were still very much in the Cold War. And so we were in a moment where we were fighting an existential battle between what we described as good and evil, two different conceptions of society and life, of democracy versus communism. And so we can't really separate our ideas of 1976 with and 1776 with that global order. We are obviously not living in that same moment, and our I would argue our international community is much messier. It's much harder to define, and I think as a result, Americans have always done better when we have a common enemy that we can focus our energies against. When we don't have one common enemy, we tend to look for enemies within. And
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so all I was going to say was that I think in this moment we are struggling. I see us grappling more with how to see this anniversary because we are not shaping it and framing it vis-a-vis one common enemy.
Okay, thanks. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
Elijah?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to the book I'm finishing myself on the Treaty of Paris, and I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial.
I thought you were going to say the Treaty of Paris.
Not quite. And what I would say is that I think the populist impulse that I described in my talk, which seemed like an artifact from the past in 1976, no longer seems that way. And I think it is very much present. It's a reminder that, history repeats itself oftentimes in very unexpected ways. And for me, at any rate, this has been an invitation to be humble. about, assumptions about what might come, the world we're in, what's truly past, what is only sleeping and might reawaken. And so I'm just struck by the fluidity of our moment without the fixity of the Cold War and the certainty of President Nixon's resignation and the various other things that were recent events or current in 1976.
Well, what I would say is that the recent books, John Ferling, Shots Heard Around the World, that has just come out, and there's a forthcoming second volume in Rick Atkinson's Revolution trilogy. Both those books highlight exactly what we're
Which
discussing.
you can see his book launch. We don't have tickets anymore for in person, but online you can see on April 29th here at Mount Vernon. Sorry.
But no, come see it. Come check it out. But the focus of our panel and our discussion here today on the international side of the American Revolution, that it was not just a war for America and a war in America, but it had international global reach. And I think that's something that's different from 1976. Mm-hmm. I'd be curious, since you raised this question, what 1876 would have been like, of how people would have seen the centenary, not just the bicentenary. But here we see it in a much more international context, which is an interesting phenomenon.
Right. Well, I want to say one more time, thanks so much to Lindsay for hosting this with us. And thanks, please join me in thanking all of our speakers. Thank you.
It was really good.
Great. Thanks. And we'll break now for the second panel.
Thanks for having us.
Strengthening the nascent United States. And Washington refuses, telling Hamilton that an army is a very dangerous instrument to play with. And the starting point of civil-military relations in the United States is that point right there. But this is about these three terrific scholars. And Gary, I hope you will get us started. Gary Schmidt is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a senior scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. He got his start as a policymaker as the minority staff leader on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He's written a bunch of terrific defense and foreign policy books, and he has a sidelight in presidential powers issues. And he's just about to finish a magisterial book on that subject. Gary, get us started.
It's a great pleasure to be here. My voice is a little bit out of whack from all the pollen in the air, so bear with me. Corey, you shouldn't have said the book was almost done. Yuval's going to believe that, and then I'm really on the hook. So the first panel was really good, and there'll be some some areas where I'll be repeating some points, but I think it's well worth, because the points are important, they're worth repeating. So let me begin. Jefferson claimed that the Declaration of Independence was an expression of the American mind. If so, the American mind was fairly sophisticated when it came to matters of statecraft. The Declaration is a complex document. First, it's a declaration that the U.S. is a sovereign state, like any other state, a fact that needed to be asserted to properly receive assistance or conclude treaties with other states. Second, the break from Britain has been justified on principles avowed by no other state and had obvious sweeping potential. As Benjamin Franklin put it, quote, "Our cause is the cause of mankind," end quote. But third, the Declaration was conservative in the application of those principles, requiring a long train of abuses before such a break could be justified. And it never claimed that a republican form of government is the only legitimate form of government. Principle and prudence are the Declaration's defining features. On the world stage, a stage filled with monarchies and despotic regimes, the U.S. was, in 1776, the liberal ugly duckling, trying to fit in and indeed survive. The theme of the central sections of my paper, and the chapter eventually in the book, is how the U.S. attempted to manage surviving in this strategic environment, in the strategic environment it faced, an environment in which it was surrounded by imperial powers, faced with mercantilist trade policies by the great states, and had no like-minded regimes with which to associate. There I cover policy initiatives like the Model Treaty, and eventually, after a decade of floundering, the creation of a true national security state, a government with the requisite institutions and authorities to address what Hamilton described before the Constitution's adoption as a situation in which the country had, quote, neither troops nor treasury nor government, end quote. By 1787, arguably, most Americans no longer saw government power as simply the principal threat to their liberty, but rather as a necessary element in helping sustain it. And while there would soon be arguments about how certain powers were being employed, the fact is, with the new Constitution up and running and its authorities being aptly utilized, the country's strategic situation improved. Spain opened access to the Gulf of Mexico for American trade on the Mississippi River. British forces had moved out of the Northwest Territories, and Native American tribes were negotiating peace treaties with the U.S. The end result was a transformed, more prosperous, more loyal Trans-Appalachia. It was becoming what Jefferson had hoped, an empire of liberty. No less important, U.S. public credit was on sounder footing, providing the fiscal conditions for expanded commerce and, if need be, the ability of the government to secure loans necessary to deal with unforeseen events like wars. However, while in better shape, the U.S. was not out of the woods and still needed to mature as a power. In an attempt to give it time, Washington had initiated a policy of neutrality and calmed relations with Britain through the Jay Treaty. He also ended his tenure with the farewell address, urging Americans not to become slavish partisans to one or the other belligerent powers in Europe and have, quote, as little political connection with them as possible, end quote. But Washington, in the same speech, indicated that such restraint need not be a permanent condition once the U.S. had grown in strength and prominence. Quote, the period is not far off, he wrote, that Americans guided by its own sense of justice would make peace or war as it saw fit. It was a view shared by Alexander Hamilton. And while Hamilton spent the majority of the Pacific's essays arguing that the U.S. had no special obligation towards France if such assistance might threaten the country's survival or its basic interests, he also wrote that at some point in the future, the U.S. might well decide to intervene to assist a people who are on their way to throwing off a despotic regime. Restraint was not an iron law. Rather, it was a prudent assessment of the country's situation. Having survived a second war with Britain in 1812, Americans were feeling their oats. They were increasingly interested in supporting liberal causes abroad, and most especially recognizing the rebellious states in the Spanish colonies of Latin America, a cause publicly led by Speaker of the House Henry Clay. It was in this environment that John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, gave his famous July 4th address before Congress, appearing to tamp down the rush to formally assist the rebellions by declaring the U.S. would not go abroad, quote, in search of monsters to destroy, end quote. A precept seemingly in line with the kind of restraint that had largely defined U.S. policy since the time of Washington. But context matters here. While it's certainly true that Adams was not in favor of U.S. looking for fights with other countries like the French revolutionaries had, the great theme of the speech was an attack on the legitimacy of colonial rule altogether. Later saying that he had closeted any notion of prudence with the speech, Adams concluded the address with what was essentially a call to action for those living under such a rule. They should, Adams advised, be filled with the spirit of our own declaration and quote, and I'm quoting now, go thou and do likewise, end quote. Neither London nor the monarchies of the Holy Alliance were pleased, nor did they think Adams was a model of restraint. That said, the phrase the phrase, "not in search of monsters to destroy," was likely a signal being sent to the Spanish government that we would not weigh in on the side of the rebellions in Latin America by recognizing them as sovereign states. Adams was not willing to upset relations with Spain at that point, having just concluded a treaty with Madrid, making the U.S. a continental empire. Adams believed the treaty would go down as his greatest achievement, and he was not willing to run the risk of it coming undone at that point. Once, however, it was firmly a sealed deal, the U.S. rather rapidly established relations with the new republics. In Adams' instructions to the newly appointed American diplomats, he described the situation as, quote, "a mighty moment in human affairs," end quote, and told them that they should be actively promoting liberalism commercially and politically in the new states. They were not to be neutral when it came to those countries' domestic and foreign affairs. Indeed, in 1824, when the Colombian ambassador approached Adams about a possible formal alliance between Colombia and the U.S. as a possible deterrent to the Holy Alliance trying to reverse course in Latin America, Adams replied there would be no treaty, but that if Colombia was attacked by one of the revisionist monarchies, he assured the ambassador that the U.S. would not stay neutral in such an instance, going beyond hiding behind British naval power to maintain the Monroe Doctrine. Finally, when Adams became president, he accepted an invitation to the new Latin American republics to attend a Pan-American Congress in Panama. Although he made clear that the U.S. would not be part of any attempt to create a formal league among the republics, he did intend for the U.S. delegation to push the new states to adopt policies in support of free trade and religious tolerance at home, policies that would affect the domestic governance and reinforce ties with the United States. However, because one of the topics put on the Congress's agenda was reducing the transatlantic slave trade, along with discussions regarding the status of black-led Haiti, members of Congress from the South were quick to criticize Adams' decision to have the U.S. involved at all. They argued that this was a slippery slope of engagement that ran counter to what they said was a longstanding Washington-blessed policy of non-entanglement, non-interference. Adams' rebuttal was that they had misread Washington's intent in the farewell address. The U.S. was no longer weak. It was no longer surrounded by imperial powers. Its strategic situation had changed such that Adams could say that, quote, "upon reasoning upon the state of things, from the sound and the judicious principles of Washington," end quote, the country had reached that point at which it could assert itself and its principles more forcibly. Quote, "far from conflicting with," end quote, "with Washington's counsel," Adams said, "participation in the Panama Congress," quote, "is directly deducible from and conformable to it. The ugly duckling was growing into a swan." Throughout the period from 1776 to 1824, a period I would argue that can be seen as the beginning and the end of the founding era, American statecraft rarely, if ever, deviated from the three elements of the Declaration of Independence I first outlined. However, the weight given each would change with changes in administrations, but also as the country grew, prospered, and became a dominant power within the Western Hemisphere. With the advent of an explicitly counter-revolutionary program by major European powers, having like-minded states in America's corner of the globe would matter. The United States would not abandon its formal policy of neutrality, but with a firmer sense of its own strength and increased continental security, it was now willing to lean forward when it came to supporting the very principles it had first introduced to the world in 1776. Thank you.
So our leadoff hitter is on base. And now we come to Professor Jeremy Rabkin, who comes to us from the Antonin Scalia School of Law at George Mason University. He was for 20 years on the faculty of the Department of Government at Cornell University, where he was selected as the most impactful member of the Cornell faculty. He's written a number of very important books, including Law Without States and has a terrific recent book with John Yoo on how new technologies are changing warfare. Professor Rapkin.
Thank you. Did people stand on that? No. That's too much. But in 1913, enterprising American journalist found his way to the camp of the Mexican rebel general Pancho Villa. And he asked Villa at one point, what about the Hague Convention on the Law of War? And Pancho Villa laughed out loud and said, really? It is a funny thing to make rules about war. And then he asked the American journalist, like, did Mexico have any role in making this? He just thought it was preposterous. Now, if you knew nothing about it, you might think that the leaders of the American Revolution, 150 years earlier, would have had just that view. Whatever these rules were, they were made in Europe, and they couldn't have application to American militiamen who learned their craft by fighting Indians who did not fight by Hague rules. So you might have thought they would just say, no, we're in a new world and we have our own rules and don't tell us what to do. But actually it's the opposite. They're amazingly interested in the law of nations. People who do know a little about this, if they're law professors, often depict the founders as they were proto-supporters of the UN before their time, and that's not right. But people who think, they were Americans, and therefore they said America first, and they had populist disdain for foreigners, that is not right either. So I want to make 3 points here. First, just to elaborate this, they were very interested in the law of nations. I mean, poignantly so. Second, their understanding of the law of nations was much more cautious and realistic than many people now understand international law to be. And finally, which I'll spend the most time on, their views of this, I think, are still quite relevant to us, even though our international situation is very much different. I mean, they were a small, beleaguered set of revolutionaries facing much greater powers out there, and we are now the great power. But a lot of their interest in the law of nations had to do with how this would affect people's views about the American government in America. And I think that is still relevant, so I want to end with that. But let me just start with, they were real interested in the law of nations. To start with, the Declaration of Independence, we had it shown earlier, that was really good, in case you didn't have a chance to read it while it was up on the slide. They say in the first sentence, which everyone goes right to the second sentence, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, but the first sentence, the thing that starts it, is the claim of the United States to a separate and equal station among the powers of the earth. Where did that come from? And I think on the first panel, several people said they were influenced by Vattel. More than influence, they loved Vattel. So let me just say a little bit about Vattel. I have one slight difference with Professor Hay, who said, well, like Grotius, he was a bit, then there was Vattel. Grotius is completely unreadable. I mean, first of all, it was in Latin, and there weren't good translations. Vattel was in French, which a lot of the founders could read. But it was right away translated into English. They could get it in English. And you can read it today, and it's sort of like, yeah, that's like what a sensible American would think about many, many issues. Vattel's book is called Principles, it's called The Law of Nations, but the subtitle is Principles of Natural Law Applied to the Conduct of Nations and of Sovereigns. Natural law, nations, and sovereigns, he goes right to it. Vattel gives you kind of like, as a matter of natural law, since all men are equal, the various states which they make are equal, and they're all in a state of nature with each other. And he gives you a kind of, you know, easy version of Locke for busy diplomats. Locke is much more qualified. Locke has long sentences with semicolons. Vattel is just like straight out like a yes. A dwarf is as much a man as a giant is, Vattel says in the introduction. A small republic is no less a sovereign state than the most powerful kingdom. Yeah, okay, yes. This is, of course, very appealing to what is basically a small state struggling for international recognition. So they're like, Vattel, yes. It was mentioned that we wanted the Declaration of Independence to be seen in Europe. This is also a good story. The publisher of the second edition of Vattel, it had come out in the 1750s. He was making a new edition in the mid-1770s. He sent copies to Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin said, could you send extra ones? There are people in the Continental Congress who want to see it. So they were paying attention. And this guy then became the publicist for the American Revolution. He immediately translated the Declaration into French and I think into Dutch and Spanish and other languages. He circulated around. He published the state constitutions. He was like a press agent for the American Revolution in Amsterdam, in Europe. And the leaders of the revolution, they were relying on him to be the advance man and to make this work, and they just drank up what he gave them, Vattel, yes. I should say just one or two more things about like how interested they were in all this. They had few people have had military experience in the French and Indian War. They didn't have experience of high command. They certainly didn't have a lot of experience in diplomacy, the leaders of the American Revolution. So this is the poignant part. They were reading about it. I read this recently. The British officers were amazed that they found in the packs of captured American officers memoirs of Frederick the Great. Why were they reading it? Because they wanted to know about it. They didn't have a lot of experience. They thought, I'll read up. And Henry Knox, who becomes a great general in the war, and then Washington's Secretary of War, he got to this position because he owned a bookshop in Boston, and he stocked up with books on military history and tactics. And people were saying, like, oh, you know about this? Like artillery, how would we use this? I have a book. So they were very interested in books, and they were interested in the law of nations, so they were very interested in Vattel. If you look at the letters that John Adams sends back to the Continental Congress during the time of his a number of diplomatic appointments in Europe during the Revolution, he's constantly saying, and you have to mention that our tactics of seizing British ships, British merchant ships, that's totally consistent with the law of nations. Totally consistent with the law of nations. He thinks it's very important to say to the outside world, we're doing this by the book. And that meant literally, we read Vattel's treatise. We know what we're allowed to do. So this was important to them, and they believed in it. One other just poignant anecdote. We know that President Washington, when he became president, and how there are all these issues about, oh, there's a war between France and Britain. We have a treaty with France. Does this mean we have to aid France? What should our position be? He went to a library in New York and took out Vattel's treatise, or translation of it. And he kept it. And it was found 230 years later here at Mount Vernon, because he didn't give it back. I just read a newspaper article others at Mount Vernon was going to make some compensation to the library because the compound interest on the dues was approaching the national debt. The Constitution shows a lot of interest in the law of nations in a variety of ways, starting with treaties will be the supreme law of the land. and the judges in each state shall be bound thereby, notwithstanding anything in their own state laws or constitutions. Like the treaties have to be regarded, and they, I think, took for granted, certainly John Jay says in the Federalist Papers, don't worry, federal judges will be able to enforce this. So they did. We remember, if you've taken American history, like, oh yes, John Marshall, Marbury versus Madison, he laid the foundations of constitutional law in his rulings on constitutional questions. Over 30 years or so on the Supreme Court, John Marshall decided 3 times as many cases on international law as on constitutional law. If you're interested, the count is 195 cases on international law as against 62 on US constitutional law. So this was thought to be important. Let me say briefly, it was important. They thought it was important because they wanted to avoid provoking foreign nations unnecessarily. A great saying, a gentleman is someone who never offends anyone unintentionally. They understood perfectly well that sometimes you need to have sharp elbows, sometimes you need to have threats. Just as one great example, we signed this peace treaty with, not peace treaty, sorry, military alliance with France in 1778. And one of the provisions is, henceforth there will be perpetual amity between us. 2 years later, they're discussing maybe the French should help us invade Canada. And Washington says to another American commander, terrible idea. If they get into Canada, we may never get them out. So he doesn't believe at all perpetual amity means we don't have to worry about them. He's very worried about them being nearby. We promised, at least it was understood by the French, that we would not, we said in this treaty, we will not agree to a separate peace with Britain. And then the American diplomats in Paris start negotiating separately with British delegation. John Jay, one of the negotiators, writes back to the President of the Continental Congress. He says, we were determined faithfully to fulfill our treaty with France, yet it was a different thing to be guided by their or our construction of it. In other words, we will faithfully adhere to what we think it meant. I don't mean to mock that. That is, I think, to this day, the guiding principle of correct approach to treaties. I mean, we insist on our own version of it. We didn't really think you could have, I mean, in 1780s, who would determine the correct meaning of a treaty? Actually, the United States was a pioneer of international arbitration, was mentioned in the earlier panel. John Jay negotiates this treaty with Britain, where claims of people who had property confiscated, loyalists had their property confiscated, they could be raised in America, and Americans could raise, through a panel of arbitrators, claims about British confiscation, mostly ships on the high seas. That was very controversial, but it was the initial precedent for international arbitration. The interesting thing about it is that at the time, it was thought the Senate had to agree to the precise terms of what issues will be submitted and who will be the arbitrators. That continued to be the American practice until 1945, when we agreed to, like, oh, the International Court of Justice, yes, okay, sure, anyone can sue us. But then we tried to add stipulation, but only under these terms. For 150 years, the understanding was we can accept arbitration, but only if the Senate understands exactly what's being submitted and to whom. So we were somewhat cautious about international law at the same time that we thought it was important to show that we respected it. Let me just conclude with a little bit about why they thought this was important, apart from the obvious point that you want to show other countries were respectable, which they did. And I want to emphasize here, they thought it would matter to American opinion. Right after the Treaty of Peace is signed in 1783, John Adams writes to the President of the Continental Congress, and he says, Congress ought in all their proceedings to consider the opinion that the United States or the people of America will entertain of themselves. We may call this national vanity or national pride, but it is the main principle of the national sense of its own dignity. It's important what Americans think about their country, and you need constantly to demonstrate to Americans, you live under not only a strong and effective government, but a respectable government. Madison says a few years later, talking about, in the Federalist number 62, talking about the Senate, it's good to have people with more experience who serve for longer terms. And he gives this example. They'll know more about foreign affairs, and so they'll be cautious in confirming ambassadors and ratifying treaties. And you need people like that as stabilizing, because at present, the United States is now held in no respect by her friends and become prey to every nation which has an interest in her fluctuating counsels and embarrassed affairs. We look kind of pathetic, and we need to look respectable. But again, I want to emphasize their view of respectable is not just being effective, but being respectable, meaning not impulsive, not giving in to like demagogic demands. I give a couple of examples of this in the paper. Let me close by saying about this example, and then just a little bit more about what it means. Finally, in 1812, after years of protesting against British interference with American trade and American shipping, Madison goes to Congress and says we have to declare war. And he gives a recital. They have violated international law. Our rights have been violated. And then he goes a little bit beyond this. He says, if we put up with this any longer, these violations of our rights, the consequences will be devastating, not to our trade, I mean, yes, not to our security, yes, but to our national spirit. He says to accept this any longer, we can't accept it any longer without breaking down the spirit of the nation, destroying all confidence in itself and in its political institutions, either perpetuating a state of disgraceful suffering or regaining by more costly sacrifices and more severe struggle our lost rank and respect among independent nations. So part of the point of invoking international standards is to restrain us from doing impulsive and stupid things, but another part is to say we are totally justified in fighting back, in asserting ourselves, because we are in the right. And we know we are in the right because it is so in international law. You can read it in Vattel, a book which we've been reading now for decades. Let me close with this. Independence is a complicated, when you think about it, and paradoxical idea. Robinson Crusoe on his island had no need to assert his independence. He also didn't need property rights, trade agreements. He was all alone. In international affairs, as in private life, independence is relational. It is a claim that you're making against others, or you have some sense of like who they are and how they might lean on you or encroach on you. In Vattel, as in Locke, as in all kinds of 18th century literature, they have this idea in the state of nature where there is no government, you still have rights. But there's also a law that restrains the exercise of your rights, natural law. You can't invade the rights of others. It was obvious to everyone. Of course, that's a very insecure situation. If you don't have courts and sheriffs, you need to assert your own rights, so you need to have confidence. You also need to have a certain amount of restraint because you need other people to say, oh yeah, you're probably right, okay, it's okay. To do that, you need to have a track record, or at least a reputation, character. The people say like, oh, okay, if he's fighting, he probably has a good reason. You might say both to resist the pressures of giving in And to have the confidence to fight back, but not to overdo it, you need to have a sense of honor. I point out to you that the Declaration of Independence begins with this sentence, which, when you get right to it, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, and the important word there is necessary, just a necessity. But the last word of the Declaration, you can look it up, the very last word is honor. International law was for the founding generation, and correctly understood could be for us a kind of gauge of, are we acting honorably? And it is still, I think, important to us today, as it was in the 18th and the early 19th century, to feel that our government is acting honorably, and for nations around the world to sense that, okay, even if we disagree with the Americans, they are acting honorably. So, thank you.
So we have two runners on base, and our cleanup hitter is Walter Russell Mead, the Alexander Hamilton Professor of Strategy and Statecraft at the University of Florida and the Ravenel Curry Fellow at the Hudson Institute. He is the author of the most consequential book about the origins of American foreign policy. It's called Special Providence. He's also the author of several other important books, God and Gold, about the origins of Anglo-American strategy, Ark of the Covenant, about the US-Israeli relationship. Walter, put these runners in play.
All right. Well, in me, you behold another victim of the pollen, so I hope it won't be, I hope you'll understand me and that I won't collapse in a fit of coughing while I'm here. We'll see what happens. Well, certainly listening to these earlier talks, I was inspired to think how happy the Founding Fathers would be if they could return to our day and see a government so intently focused on honor and respectability. The word restraint came to mind. It really, from in the Empyrean, they must look down with terrific joy today, unmatched joy. When I look at American history, the first thing that strikes me always is how very short it is. And while the country's history, we're celebrating the 250th anniversary, that may seem like a long time. But when I was 13 years old, there was an old gentleman who was kind of semi-retired on the faculty of the boarding school that I was beginning to attend. And he had graduated from high school in 1892, from Harvard in 1896, and then he was teaching there, so he'd actually literally been one of Franklin Roosevelt's high school teachers. But more than this, when he was a young boy, this is what I heard from one of my classmates who was in his family, there was an older lady who lived with them who, when she was a young girl, had actually met George Washington at Mount Vernon. So as we are gathered here today at Mount Vernon, I am 2 degrees of separation from George Washington, and everyone here is 3 degrees. So congratulations on forging a historic link. And there is a lot of continuity in the way Americans think and argue about our foreign policy. Many of the debates that we have today are entirely recognizable if you go back and you look at the debates of the 1790s and the 1820s and the 1870s and on and on. We sort of keep spinning up the same kinds of arguments. We keep falling back on the same sorts of examples or patterns of behavior. And very often we get it wrong. And as I look, let's talk about this period of time, roughly 50 years between 1776 and maybe 1824, 25, when American foreign policy, I think, does pass through a period of real questioning of basic assumptions. What does our security look like? What are we trying to do? What are our dangers? Who are our natural allies or enemies? All of these things were up for grabs in that period. But if you look back at the track record, we didn't actually do very well. Try to imagine how today's press would cover Jefferson's embargo, where you basically destroyed the American economy without having really any impact on France or Britain to speak of. That this was, now that idea has certainly remained an important one. The South thought that the rest of the world was so dependent on Southern cotton, they would come crawling on hands and knees to recognize the Confederacy. And of course, today we often think that sanctions and withholding the benefits of trade and so on with us will easily and quickly produce some kind of desired results overseas. So many of our bad ideas never die. They linger on, and as a nation, we appear impervious to any reflection on, gee, we've tried that 15 times and it almost never works. Let's try it again. But I think during this period of time, in this early period of the early republic, you had some basic questions out there, and the debates between Jefferson and Hamilton in Washington's cabinet, the storm over issues like the Jay Treaty, continuing on and on through this period. If you really look at them, you can see there are a couple of big issues going on. One would be, to what extent should ideology be the center of American foreign policy? That is, the French are trying to fight a democratic war. Should we therefore, what obligation do we have to support them against the monarchies of Europe? And shouldn't we really be out there? So you have that position. But then you also had questions of balance of power. So that for the Americans who were feeling quite vulnerable at the time, people talk about 3,000 miles of ocean keeping us safe. No one really felt that much in the 1780s and 90s. It was more that just sort of at any day, on any one of the number of points along your coast, an enemy fleet could appear bringing trouble. And so did our safety lie? Britain was clearly the ruler of the seas. So France was the strongest land power in Europe, and we potentially would be a strong land power. So should the two land powers on these distant continents collaborate to sort of humble the monarch of the seas? Was Britain the greatest threat? It was certainly the only country with the capability of seriously invading the United States. And what is interesting is that over this period, we sort of pushed and pulled in different ways, but fundamentally resolved those two problems mostly in, sort of in parallel lines. We ended up taking the British rather than the French side, to the extent we took a side. That is, we thought that actually we were better off with the British being a predominant naval power, but nevertheless enough worried about what was going on in Europe that you would have a country strong enough to keep all the other European countries locked up in Europe, but not able to attack you or willing to attack you. And on the other hand, that while ideology was a wonderful thing and liberty is a wonderful thing and Americans should promote it, that is very rarely going to be enough of a justification. There were sort of two disappointments, I think, that led to that. One is that the French Revolution just turned out so badly from the standpoint of liberty. You could argue maybe in 1789, 1790, this was this wonderful movement for freedom. 1792, not so much. 1795, hardly at all. And Napoleon ends up becoming, the worst and most aggressive despot out there. But on the other hand, too, you were already beginning to see in the 1820s that the Republican anti-colonial movements in South America were perhaps not going to end up setting up a set of utopian fabulously governed societies in the Western Hemisphere. So that ideology, the fact that someone professes liberty and they profess democratic principles and even seem to begin, to be serious about it, doesn't mean they're going to be successful in making those principles stick. And so for you to base your foreign policy around an assumption that we're all in a common cause here, you might turn out to be disappointed. So caution on ideology, and then a sense of the balance of power in Europe is a good thing for the United States, and weakening Britain isn't really in our interest. I'm always interested in the War of 1812. It's I think the war that gets much less respect than it deserves from historians. I think maybe a lot of people think, well, if Teddy Roosevelt could write a good book about it, I'm certainly not going to waste my time on this. But it is in one way, it is the most astonishing example of bad American political judgment that we've seen. Why do we go to war? Because the British orders in council were intolerable. Well, we go to war, and like a couple of weeks later, the ship comes into port with the news, orders of council revoked. But it's too late, and we've got the war on our hands. And you look at what people predicted: the British will never invade, Washington burns to the ground. The war will bring Americans together, New England is starting to secede. So it's very interesting. It's also very interesting, by the way, that the more anti-war party, the Federalists, is completely extinguished by the end of a war in which they had been right about almost all of the arguments. Something that John Kerry might have wanted to reflect on, I think. Being right about foreign policy on the merits is not necessarily a guarantee of electoral success. The bigger miscalculation, it seems to me, that Americans made is if you think about the situation in Europe. Where was Europe in the summer of 1812 as we start launching this war? Napoleon was at the peak of his power. Britain had its back to the wall. It was exhausted after fighting 20 years of unsuccessful wars against France. Europe was almost entirely under Napoleon's domination. And so at this moment, it would have seemed like, wow, what a great time to have a war with England. They're really in trouble. Okay, so we go to war, and then what happens? Napoleon invades Russia. And by the sort of 6-8 months into the war, Napoleon is on the defensive. The war starts going against him badly, and by 1814, when we're negotiating peace or hoping to get peace with Britain, Napoleon is beaten. Britain is acknowledged as the mistress of Europe, the great victor of the war, and is now more powerful than ever. We were very, very lucky to get out of that war intact. But I've always enjoyed, I think, what is the moment that made possible the new relationship. We've already spoken today about when did Britain recognize the United States as being here to stay or an equal. For me, the moment when that happened was in 1814. They've defeated Napoleon. The Duke of Wellington is like the greatest general in British history since the Duke of Marlborough. Tremendous prestige. Britain has a huge army, and the government offered Wellington 100,000 men, an army of 100,000 men in Canada, to be used for the suppression of the United States. Let's just deal with these people once and for all. And he thought about it, and he told them, no, I will not accept this command. There is no honor to be gained in attacking the United States. You sort of, it's not concentrated in a city. You sort of will move through, your army will move through and they'll rise up behind you. It's just, I'm not going to do it. And when their greatest general, who's just led them to their greatest victories, won't take it at a moment when there's no way the Americans could have matched their resources, this, I think, was a real hinge point of history. And what has interested me too is, I guess, where did he form this conclusion? He'd never been to America. But the answer is, before the Napoleonic Wars, Wellington had been stationed as a young man in India in the army, where the British commander-in-chief was Lord Cornwallis, who went there after having exactly the kind of experience that Wellington was not going to put himself through. And you can imagine these officers sitting around talking with each other, over the port after dinner. And of course the subject of the war would come up. And Cornwallis, I can see going into the story of why it's hopeless to conquer them. So, American foreign policy in the first 50 years of our republic, we got a lot of it wrong. We made humongous mistakes. We sided with the wrong people. We attacked the wrong people. We were too cautious. We were too brash. But we ended up, if you think about it, out of the Napoleonic Wars, nobody did better out of the Napoleonic Wars than the United States. We got Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase. Only 9,000 square miles smaller than Greenland, our next big acquisition, I'm told. And even there, there was real sleight of hand in that actually our title to Louisiana is not legally valid. I mean, I don't know if I should say this out loud, but under the treaty that Napoleon got it from Spain, it expressly forbade him to transfer that territory to a third party. So my guess, by the way, is that if Andrew Jackson had lost at the Battle of New Orleans, the British might have taken a much more legalistic approach to that document. And so perhaps the Battle of New Orleans was not as historically irrelevant as people think. But anyway, we ended up doubling our territory on a totally shady, invalid real estate deal. And at least there, perhaps, our current president has something in common with the Founding Fathers. All right. Thank you very much.
So thank you, gentlemen, for those 3 excellent presentations. And not only, to take the baseball analogy further, not only do we have 3 runners on base, but we also have a no trade clause in the contract, which is a beautiful thing if you can get it out of the venal owners of a baseball team. I have a couple of issues I'd like to draw out from you 3 before we go to audience questions. And the first is this issue of alliances, right? The struggle in the Washington cabinet about what to do about the obligations to France undertaken as a result of French assistance in the revolution. It's such a fraught issue, and the issue of alliances we tend to treat so blithely as something that the Founding Fathers all opposed. But it was much more contested in real time over France. Genet and the interference in domestic politics by the French ambassador. And how do you see the issue of alliances? Was it a function, was their anxiety about allied obligations a function of our own weakness at the time? Or do you think they would look at a modern America with security obligations to 70 other countries as anathema to how they thought about America making obligations and making itself secure? Gary.
That's a lot. So I guess start off with, so I'll just go to Hamilton's, Pacific essays. The opening argument for Hamilton is that the treaty was undermined by the French declaring war, offensive war against other monarchies in Europe, and that the nature of the treaty that we had signed with Paris was defensive in nature. So, as a technical legal matter, Hamilton made, I think, a fairly strong argument. So it wasn't that we were violating, the argument was that we weren't so much violating the treaty as reading it, as Jeremy would say, correctly, because that's the way we read it.
John Jay said.
Yeah, but second thing is, in that regard, even though Madison and Jefferson, were pushing very hard for a more sympathetic approach to France because of past assistance and also because they hated the British, neither one of them actually was in favor of actually doing much about supporting France under the treaty, for two obvious reasons. One, the United States couldn't do much materially anyway, but the second reason was that, I think that was the principal reason. We just didn't have the capacity to do anything, and there was no real option for doing so. So it was kind of it's a weird debate between Jefferson, Madison, and Washington and Hamilton, because they both wind up in the same, actually, substantive position, which is we're not going to do anything.
Anybody else?
I just add that in the late 1790s, there are a lot of French attacks on American shipping. And we say, no, you have to compensate us for this. This is terrible. And we're going to start attacking French shipping, but we're only doing it in retaliation. But you really have to compensate us for this. And then Adams negotiates a treaty with France in 1800, which is, okay, the 1778 treaty, that's over, and that's enough for us. We don't insist on compensation for Americans, which we have been saying was absolutely crucial. So we thought it was worth a lot to get out of the French alliance. And I wouldn't say that totally answers your question, but it is a reminder we didn't like being in an alliance at that time. And when this treaty came to the Senate, Adams was rather unpopular. Jefferson's followers are like, yeah, okay, let's vote for it. Yes, let's get out of the French treaty. They didn't like having a treaty. I had just one other thing.
I was just going to say that one of the principal points in the instructions for those negotiating the treaty was, in fact, they had to get out.
Yeah. We wanted to get out.
Yeah.
We didn't want to be obligated. There are a lot of peculiar circumstances of that era, but actually we forget that the United States did not sign a peacetime alliance until 1947. So we went for a very long time with the understanding, like a security guarantee, right? And that is, by the way, not NATO, that's the Rio Pact, right, to countries in Latin America. The characteristic thing that we do is we don't sign a formal treaty with Latin America. We just say, trust us, we'll protect you. But we'll decide when and how, because it's our guarantee. So you don't really need to be part of this. Right? But we had a historic aversion to this, and somebody, Professor Gould, I think, said, the past comes back. Right? The past is not past. It's not dead. It's not even past. So it's come back.
Walter, I'm sorry, Gary, you were.
No, but let Walter, because I have a comment after that.
On this, Walter?
I would say that on that 1800 treaty, that at least part of it was that you're not going to get anything else from France. You want to hype up, oh, I got a treaty, look. Because otherwise, it's a very humiliating piece of paper.
Yes, but people could have voted against it on the grounds that it was a sellout, but they seem to accept that it's worth it to get out of that treaty.
Well, they knew that there was nothing better and that they had something. So I think people will be on both, sort of 60% of one and 40% of the other.
Go, Gary.
Yeah, so one little caveat, I think, is that one has to recognize when you're talking about treaties of alliance at this point in time, the United States was the only liberal republic there. So, there was a kind of a realist argument that you shouldn't be involved with signing, alliance treaties with polities that were obviously had different interests and different ways of thinking about their interest. There's an interesting example of this is that Adams at one point runs off to the Netherlands and actively involves himself in trying to get the reform movement in the Netherlands to basically overturn the existing system of government there to turn it into a liberal republic. And Adams remarks that the reason why you would do this is because then the Netherlands, the United States would be natural partners.
Oh.
So there's there's an ideological character to some of this discussion about alliances and the realism that goes with it.
That's a really nice point. The second issue I wanted to raise is the commercial issue, because Professor Rabkin, you mentioned that Justice Marshall's majority of the cases decided on the Supreme Court were international in nature. My guess is many of them were predominantly commercial decisions. Gary, you wrote a book on Justice Marshall's jurisprudence. And Walter, one of my very favorite parts of Special Providence is when you talk about the Hamiltonian perspective on financial esprit. So how much is the commercial weight of American need weighing in international decision-making and in American foreign policy in the early years of the Republic? Walter, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Walter, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, usually people ask me to do the opposite. It clearly was an immense interest. I think people forget, and this is particularly true of the sort of generation of historians who come after World War II, just how globally integrated the American economy was. I mean, for example, if you go to the sort of Jacksonian backwoods people in the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains, their main source of cash at the time was ginseng, which would be sold in Asia for very high prices. George Washington's dinnerware here at Mount Vernon was a set of china that came from China in one of the first vessels to come back to China from the U.S. in the China trade. So if you think about even before independence, Eli Yale got the money that he was able to get, probably the cheapest naming right opportunity in the history of the United States.
Wasn't such a great college.
That he, he got it in Madras as an agent of the East India Company. In fact, you can go to Chennai today, and his wedding is in the church registry in Chennai. And Brown University was also founded by profits from the India trade. So not just with Europe, but globally, from just the very earliest times, Americans are thinking about this. We're a commodity economy integrated into that North Atlantic thing. And so it touched everyone, and it was clearly one of the main reasons a lot of people would have ratified the Constitution. We need a federal government that can handle all of these disputes and so on with foreigners. So yes, I think the commercial stuff was of great interest. And then in another slightly less pleasant way, after the revolt in Haiti, the fear in the South about the future of the security of the slave owners against possible slave revolts really begins to peak. The founders, Washington and his generation, were quite sure that slavery was economically backward and would die away naturally, as indeed it did in most of the northern colonies. They couldn't predict the cotton gin and the textile industrial revolution and so on. But as the sort of slave interest became both more economically important in the United States and more paranoid about its future, particularly as abolitionism begins to grow in Britain, the perceived need to have a strong navy to prevent British abolitionism from infecting us, and also an active foreign policy that would, for example, try to persuade Spain not to ban slavery in Cuba and things of that kind, even as the British were trying to get them to do it, was one of the factors that pulled us. It's a commercial factor. I don't like it, but it was there, and I think it testifies to the permanent importance of the commercial dimension of American foreign policy.
I just add a footnote. When John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State, he gives instructions to our first minister to independent Colombia. And he says, you should try and negotiate a trade treaty. That's really important. And then he goes into this rhapsody. He says, the model treaty was as important as the Declaration of Independence. They were two parts of the same system. What the Declaration of Independence was to our internal political status, the trade treaty was to our stance toward the world. And he goes on and on. This seems a little bit crazy, possibly influenced by the fact that his father was the principal drafter of the model treaty. But actually, I think it captured something thematic, which is we wanted to have relations with a lot of countries without getting too involved with them. That is an ideal of independence. And you see this in Washington's farewell address says, people remember let's not have, he doesn't say entanglement, but let's not have political commitments, but extend our commercial relations. Yeah, that's a good thing to do. And the model treaty had this thing which we tried to negotiate with other countries, not successfully, usually, but it echoes down to our time. And it's something which I guess the current administration is not interested in, but it was the foundation of the GATT and the WTO, which is the most favored nation clause. And I believe the first place that appears is in the model treaty. That is, we say to the French, we're not telling you exactly what to do with us, but if you are more generous with some other country, you have to do that for us. Treat us the way you treat the most favored nation. And that in a way captures the, we don't want to get into all the details, but don't put America second in commerce.
Gary?
Yeah, I mean, the model treaty was actually the first foreign policy initiative taken after the Declaration. I mean, in some ways. So, John Quincy Adams is sort of right that they do couple together. And if you look at the model treaty, it's all about 90% of it is about commerce. And I think there's a little bit other element to it, though, as well, which is Adams, who's written it, does have a sense that, look, if you can get more nations to have free trade, there's a likelihood or there's a possibility that you'll have a more liberal society domestically, but also internationally. So there was, I mean, again, it turns out in a world where most of the great powers are mercantilist, the model treaty doesn't really work. But nevertheless, there was a sort of a bit of a reformist agenda behind the model treaty, besides just not wanting to be politically tied down to another country.
Would anyone else like a chance to pitch to these hitters? Yes.
Say that the first 50 years of American foreign policy, and possibly extending all the way to the Vietnam War, was mainly the triumph of pragmatism over ideology.
Can you guys repeat the question?
Yes, the question was, would you describe the first 50 years of American foreign policy as the triumph of pragmatism over ideology?
And continuing forward to the Vietnam War. I mean, I think the relationship of ideology, or we give it a more positive valence, idealism in American foreign policy compared to pragmatism. This is one of the things that historians constantly debate, and you're going to find a lot of different viewpoints, possibly even here on this panel, about that. But I do think that a lot of historians would actually point to the Spanish-American War. Walter McDougall has done this and some others as a kind of a turning point, where if you look at the reasons for McKinley's declaration of war, and his message asking for the declaration of war, and you also look at the politics about him, this seems to qualify in some ways as a humanitarian intervention. So that a lot of people will say that what's happened is that American power has grown. Americans have lost inhibitions about projecting ideology into foreign policy. And then at times when we feel that maybe things are a little bit riskier and uglier, we retreat from ideology and get back to pragmatism. And then we kind of go on a pendulum like that. That would be one way.
I want to pile onto that answer about the because I too was thinking about the Spanish-American War, and something that hasn't come up yet in the discussion is the role of religion in American foreign policy. And one of the ways in which the United States is exceptional is how centrally important religion is in American policies. It is unusual among free societies how much religion colors American policy. And the Spanish-American War is my favorite example of that, because it gets rolled out as the sort of debutante ball of the US as a great power. But it's actually American religious communities that originate the activism against Spanish depredations in Cuba. Anybody else want to weigh in either on that question or on religion?
I just wanted to sort of say that the categories sometimes are not absolutely apt for thinking through what role ideology plays in American foreign policy. I mean, there's an argument to be made that, you know, you're more realistic if you're dealing with like-minded countries, and so, you know, there's a realism to sort of a principled foreign policy of a certain character. That doesn't mean that you don't have to act in your self-interest, or that, you know, necessity doesn't force you to, you know, side with less than savory countries for reasons of you know, national security and survival. But the categories you have to be very careful about how you use those categories. And there's a tendency for us modern Americans to use terminology that we've got very comfortable with in this day and age to apply it to, you know, past events.
That's a nice point. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a variant of perhaps the question that was asked earlier, but you know, in the 1820s, you get a lot of towns, particularly out west, that are suddenly named Bolivar. You have you know, young Americans who are being named after, you know, South American revolutionaries. In the 1790s, you have you know, young Americans parading in the streets in Philadelphia, demanding that we defend France and that we join France in a war against Great Britain. Today, you had, at least at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, a lot of Americans who felt very personally connected to this. So I'm wondering if what patterns are there in American history where a kind of local ideology does sort of, from the ground up, play a role in shaping American foreign policy, maybe connecting to some of the themes about honor that Professor Rapkin brought up earlier.
What an interesting question. Why don't we go down the line and give an answer to it, or anything else you'd like to say in closing? Gary, why don't you start?
Well, you know, one of the things I noticed when I was looking at John Quincy Adams was he was holding back Madison and Jefferson in this period, who were very anxious to sort of leap forward and involve themselves in the Latin American republics. And indeed, when Britain, the foreign minister said, "Why don't we get together and work on this together?" Madison and Jefferson were like, "Yes, all this is going to be great for the freedom and liberalism around in this whole hemisphere." So I would just say that, look, you know, while the Declaration of Independence was primarily a document of state meant to declare independence, it did lay down principles that Americans, you know, as Jefferson said, it was the American mind. And so therefore, it's impossible to disassociate the Americans, local or national, from those same principles. So it's always in the kind of DNA of America. So it's not unnatural that when circumstances arise internationally, that sort of seem to call upon those principles that, Americans react that way.
Jeremy?
Well, I agree. This is a recurring pattern. And I agree with Gary. I mean, it's in a way not surprising because we have a relatively open political system and people are encouraged to pay attention. And so they express their feelings. And there are a lot of foreign situations that sort of encourage people's sympathies. I just want to emphasize you're not getting this if you say the alternatives are idealism or realism or idealism and pragmatism, because I think people thought there was a certain ideal in being independent, and independence means we don't get dragged into other people's quarrels.
Yeah.
And people thought that was good. I mean, they didn't think that was selfish. They thought that was like, you have to look after yourself. And you don't want to be interfering with your neighbors, and you don't want to be dragged into their quarrels. And a lot of these things, if you know something about it, says John Quincy Adams, it's more complicated, right? And I just add one thing that we've kind of lost today, because today we talk about the West, or liberalism, or something, but what they talked about in the 19th century was the New World. The New World, right? This is even in the Monroe Doctrine, right? The New World has its own interests, which are really different from the Old World. And that was a way of distancing ourselves from, like, I don't know, there are all these kings and emperors, and it's complicated. We're in a new world, so we don't want to get drawn into that. And I would say that's not, I mean, I really feel sorry for the Ukrainians at this very moment, very much so. And I really hope that the president changes his outlook, which is possible. But I don't think it's altogether a bad thing that we have at least a, what do you call it, a tradition, a school, I mean, which is like, hey, different countries have their own destiny to work out. People said, so I read this recently, somebody characterizing Vattel's doctrine as state libertarianism. So you can see why that would appeal to Americans in the founding era as later.
Walter?
Yeah, I think we should. I'm just so modest and unassuming. I think we do need to keep religion in mind here, especially when we're talking about the grassroots nature of some of these movements. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, her husband actually, as a young man, went to fight in the Greek War of Independence. He had better luck than Lord Byron did. He came home safe and sound, but he was decorated by the Greek government for heroism. And the various Polish revolutions of the 19th century, the Hungarian Revolution, Kossuth was a huge hero in the United States, as was Garibaldi. There was actually an offer to make Garibaldi a general in the Union Army, which I think we should all be glad was not accepted. Don't think it would have worked well. But and it came, a lot of sort of evangelical, in the 19th century, evangelical religion was somewhat more, we now think of it often as a very conservative leaning set of ideas. In the 19th century, evangelicals were often on the more liberal side of things. And so revolutions for freedom against despotic rulers who were aligned with the Catholic Church that was seen at the time as being anti-freedom, including by many popes, that this created a kind of a nexus. And so people would see somebody like Kossuth as fighting for religious freedom, personal freedom, national freedom, and it just spoke to people very strongly. Again, it's not really until 1898 that it takes, that it tilts the scale and gets us into a war. But you can look at things like the fight over the fight against the dollar diplomacy and the U.S.-China railroad loan and other things were organized by missionaries. I mean, you have to, by the 1890s, you had, I would say, 20, 30,000 Americans living overseas as missionaries, often coming from out of the most prestigious colleges and very good families. And they had networks of supporters. They were supported by small group donations. They would come back every few years and make tours of churches and congregations. For many Americans, this was your only connection, direct connection with the wider world. And so that sense of personal engagement and personal commitment through missionaries, I would say as late as the 1950s, when this powered a lot of the U.S. reaction to the Chinese Communist victory in 1949, expelling American missionaries, reaction to the Armenian genocide of 1915. Again, in many cases, those were clients and of American missionaries at work in that part of the world. So we should never underestimate this, and we should, to try to understand it today, we would think of a combination. Imagine if the NGO universe, which is coded left by and large, and the Christian evangelical coalition that is coded more right, imagine them as a fusion group acting in American politics. And that's, I think, a way to understand some of the politics of humanitarian intervention and democracy promotion in the 19th century.
My friends, won't you join me in thanking these three outstanding thinkers?
Let's thank Corey too, and thank you all for being with us today. We do have a reception right outside on the terrace. Please join us, and thanks everybody for a great day.